Hey folks, how's it going? Welcome back to my Instagram TV. Hopefully you like the stuff that I'm putting on here. Whoa, this camera's a bit all over the shop. And thanks for all the feedback on Instagram Live the other day. Thanks for watching. This one's all about, it's actually two subjects I'm going to put into one 10-minute block. And the two subjects that I'm going to hit is adaptation and simulation. I spoke about them a little bit earlier on my story after my run today. And a lot of people have asked, like, what is adaptation? When do I know when I'm fully adapted? When don't I know? And how do I train for it? So I want to start with adaptation. And I want to start off by saying that as humans, we adapt to different things. If we put things into our routine, you might have heard the phrase, we're creatures of habit. If we put things into our routine and create a habit for it, we start to adapt to it. Simple example of this is if you're going to wake up tomorrow morning and go for a 5-kilometer run. If you've not run 5 kilometers before, that would be a massive shock to the system. However, if you did it repeatedly, maybe twice a week and then 3 times a week and then 4 times a week, you could actually, over time, you could actually get to a stage where you could do that run and you wouldn't even feel it. That 5K would seem super easy because basically what's happened now is that you actually adapted. Your body has become adapted to it. It's become the norm for you that every day you wake up and you do that run. So therefore, that almost answers the question of how we adapt to something. You're not going to adapt to something. You're not going to get more comfortable at doing something, no matter what it is. If it's physical training, if it's public speaking, if it's anything that you can think of, unless you do it frequently. Now, one of the biggest things that we see is that people actually go in a little bit too aggressive. They're like, this week I'm going to run 5K every single day, 5 times. And what happens is the body is not ready for that. And it takes a little bit of adjustment. Second day, you're aching all over because you haven't run for the last 20 years. And then by the third day, you're just like, screw this, I'm not getting out of bed. So adaptation does take a little bit of time. One of the things that you have to take into consideration as well is how we really measure that. In training, there's different ways that we can use to measure it. Obviously, the time that it takes, and also a lot of biofeedback, like how do you feel after it? So if you're running 3 times a week, how do you actually feel? And I think biofeedback, we'll maybe do a whole other show on biofeedback because in the era now that we're using a lot of technology, which is all fantastic, biofeedback is something that can come alongside with technology to actually gauge how we're really feeling. In the past, we've used biofeedback all the time. Like, how did you actually feel when you got up this morning? What was your muscle soreness like? How did you feel in the session? Also, you might have heard this before, rate of perceived effort. Like, how hard did you think you actually pushed yourself in that session? These are all sort of biofeedback markers that we use. And we're actually going back to using some of those more human markers. A lot of people haven't actually gone away from them. I've always asked myself, like, how do I feel? What's my soreness level like this morning? And you can create some really easy charts, like 1 to 5, 5 meaning like I literally cannot sit on the toilet, and 1 meaning like I jump out of bed, do a double backflip. So that biofeedback is super important. So there's some markers we should have in place when we're looking into adaptation. Other markers we can look at is, you probably heard me talk about it a little bit before, like waking heart rate or heart rate variability. Go and check out the guys over at HRV for training if you want to get involved in that. I actually use it with all of the people that I coach online so I can see how their recovery is going and see how they're adapting. They'll then go, let's go back to that 5K example. They'll then be able to, as you see them adapting, you can add in more of those runs. So if the goal was to get them to run 5K every day, 5 days a week, we can see by those markers, by things like the performance in the run, so measuring their heart rate within the run, looking at how they recover, so their recovery heart rate, their heart rate variability, and that biofeedback, then we can see when we're in a good stage to add that stuff in. So adaptation is something that will happen, but it does take a lot of time. If you look at endurance to adapt, like some of you might have heard, the maximum aerobic function math test, and we're actually trying to get some adaptation in that heart rate zone. It takes a lot of time, and that's where you need to have a lot of patience as well. You'll know that you're adapted if you have those measures and markers in place, and they're super important. Otherwise, you might keep telling yourself, oh no, I'm not really adapted. But if you take a simple example of 5K run 5 days a week, you'll know when you can get to do it and when actually that run becomes super simple. And that you can transfer that, as long as you have those measures in place, you can transfer that into everything you're doing. If we go back to what I was saying before, public speaking, first time you go to public speaking, were you nervous? Did you get a dry mouth? Were you sweating everywhere? Like, these things happen in public speaking, and then later on you're like, actually, I no longer get a dry mouth. I no longer am nervous. I no longer shiver, and I no longer just completely start sweating when I start talking to people. So you've adapted, you've become more comfortable. Second thing, halfway there. Second thing we're going to speak about is simulation. The question that I got before, and I'll just read this out. How do we train for the struggles that we're going to come across in an event, be it a CrossFit event? And this applies to a lot of different things. So it could apply to a triathlon, it could apply to an ultramarathon. Like in an ultramarathon, you're going to get hallucinations. How do you train to be able to simulate hallucinations? Like, it's quite a crazy thing because we don't ever really want anyone in that situation, but also when you get there, we want you to partially know how it feels. How does it feel in a CrossFit workout that's like 4 minutes long? Like, you want to die after a minute, but you've got to keep going for another 3 minutes. So we need to create this simulation. So what I say to a lot of people is, what are you actually doing with your coach to simulate the physical and mental pain that you're going to encounter? The two things that are the problem is physical and mental pain. That's what's happening in these situations. So we need to create some form of simulation. So if we look into CrossFit, and if you're a competitive CrossFit athlete, or even if you're not, like, how often are you going super, super hard in a workout? Because when a competition comes up, you need to tap into that. You need to know a little bit what it feels like. Yeah, it's not great. It's going to hurt a lot. But you need to know there's nothing better than starting a CrossFit workout and going, I really know how hard I can go. So in this work, I've done it before. In this workout, I can just push, and when it gets hard, you're like, yeah, I know I've got another 10 or 15%. So that's a really important aspect for CrossFit. In triathlon, I see a lot of people training swimming, then they're training running, then they're training cycling, or other way around. They probably spend a lot more time cycling than they do swimming, but they're training these things in a single domain. Obviously, a lot of what we see is triathletes actually getting off the bike and going for a run afterwards for a very short time. That simulates that, or doing a brick session. But how often is your coach in training giving you that to help you simulate it? In running, I think it's super important, and that's where this question actually came from. The last 3 days, I've been in quite a simulation phase and also in an adaptation phase of running 3 hours a day for the last 3 days. And on the first day, to kick off this training block, thanks a lot for Tom, I actually ran those 3 hours later in the day so that my body, my cortisol levels would be high at night, stressed, can't sleep very well, and knowing that I have to wake up at 6 the next morning and run it for another 3 hours in the beautiful rain here in the UK. So what we're trying to do is I've got an ultra event coming up. I'll tell you a lot about that later. What we're trying to do is we're trying to simulate that so we know what it feels like. So if you're going for an ultra, like if it's a multi-stage ultra, you need to be getting used to doing back-to-back days. If you're training for a marathon, you need to start increasing those distances. You don't always need to absolutely put yourself in the hole. You don't need to get the hallucinations, but you need to know exactly what it feels like, and different things are going to be happening. And why do we do simulate these things is because then we can see how the body reacts. We can ask ourselves, we can again look at heart rate reaction, pace reaction in CrossFit or in endurance as well. And we can look at the biomarkers as well. Like, how did you really feel during that? Was there any niggles? And then we can start to react. We can start to change things up. If you don't simulate things, then you're not going to know, and you're going to end up in an event or in a race, and it's going to be all completely new. And it could have been something you could have simulated in your training before, learned from, and made a solution for. So there we go. Adaptation, simulation, super important, two real big keys. And as I said, I probably speak for a whole podcast about this, but I just thought I'd share that. A few of you have had some questions. Hopefully it's helpful. Thank you.